This is the man in the corner seat. Tonight I shall be reading the story A Tall Spindly Fellow from Mark Ronson's book Super Ghosts. Chapter 1. "Oh, I'm so glad we decided to live here," said Amelia Cranswell as she watched the tip of the moon appear above the distant hills. "It's just perfect." On this warm summer evening in 1875, Amelia and her two brothers, Edward and Michael, were sitting out on the lawn where they had enjoyed a picnic supper. Close to them, a beck gurgled pleasantly, and a soft breeze sighed through the avenue of ancient trees, which led up to Croglin Hall. In such a peaceful setting, none of the young people had an inkling of the nightmare that was soon to follow. The Cranswells had come from Australia for a long visit the year before, and had found the old farmhouse, known as Croglin Hall, in Cumbria. The Fishers who owned it were moving to Thorncombe in Surrey and were pleased to lease it to them. The three young Australians soon made themselves popular among their neighbours as they settled down to enjoy the English country life. After watching the moon rise on this particular evening, they went inside the grey stone house and wished each other good night. It was 11 o'clock when Amelia went into her ground floor bedroom, where she closed her window, but not the shutters. She did not feel sleepy, and sitting in bed was able to look into the farmyard, which was bathed in a mysterious silver light. Slowly, the girl became aware of two tiny glimmering lights in the shadows. At first, she did not pay much attention to them. Probably it was something reflecting in the moon. But her interest suddenly increased as she realized they were moving and coming nearer. As they drew closer to a window, Amelia thought they might be the yellowish eyes of some animal. No, they were too high above the ground to belong to a cat or a dog. They were at the same height as human eyes. But human eyes do not glow in the dark. They vanished for a moment, then reappeared at the window, and with a thrill of fear, Amelia saw that they were gazing at her through the glass. Around them was a vague outline of a head, but it was too dark and indistinct to give the paralyzed girl any hint as to what sort of creature it might be. How long she and the unknown thing regarded each other, Amelia could not say afterwards. It was a sound which released her from a trance. The unpleasant sound of nails scratching on glass. Fear of the mysterious creature made her roll out of bed and wrench at the door handle. It did not move, and she remembered she had followed her usual custom of turning the key in the lock. All she had to do was turn it back, and she could get away from that horrible scrabbling. "Quick, quick, not a moment to lose!" In a panic, her fingers fumbled with the key, and she heard it tinkle as it struck the stone floor. As she knelt and desperately ran her fingers over the flags in a blind search for it, a new sound came to her ears. Whatever it was trying to get in, and it was unpicking the lead strips which held the glass panes in place. Glancing over her shoulder, Amelia saw a face which looked as though it was made of wrinkled leather, staring at her through a gap that it had made in the panes. Then, in the words of Captain Fisher, whose family owned Croglin Hall, a long bony finger of the creature came in and turned the handle of the window. The creature twisted its long bony fingers into her hair, dragged her head over the side of the bed, and bit her violently in the throat. Amelia became aware of low, earnest voices. "And, gentlemen, I can only conclude that the creature which attacked your sister was some large monkey which must have escaped from a travelling menagerie, or that it was a work of a madman. Not long ago I had to attend a farmer's child who had been attacked in a very similar fashion." The Australian girl opened her eyes and in the soft light of an oil lamp saw three figures standing at her bedside. Her brothers and a man she recognized as the local doctor. She raised her head to her neck and felt a bandage there. And then memory came flooding back. She remembered the screaming as the horrid thing clutched her. There were shouts from her brothers who had been awakened by her cries, and the noise they made as they forced her lock with a poker. After that, she had fainted, and her attacker had escaped through the open window as Michael and Edward burst into the room. "I'm glad to say the wounds are not deep," the doctor was saying. "More serious is the effect of such an attack on a young lady's mind. I would suggest that as soon as you, and she, is well enough to travel, you take her away on a long holiday to forget her ordeal." So, a few days later, the Cranwells left Cumbria and went to the mountains of Switzerland. Here, Amelia's terrifying experience began to fade from her mind, as she and her brothers stayed in dreamy old lakeside towns and explored alpine villages, so different from anything they had known in Australia. At last the time came to return to England, and Edward Cranswell asked her sister where she would like to live. "Why, back at Low Hall, of course," she answered. "But after what happened," began Michael. "It was frightening at the time, but I'm sure that it cannot happen again. If it was a monkey, it could not survive long in the English countryside, and if it were a madman, I'm sure the poor thing has been locked up again by now." The two young men still looked doubtful. "Look, we all love the border country. We've made some friends on the neighbouring farms, and what is more, we have a lease on the house." Her eagerness to return to Cumbria convinced them. When they got back to Croglin, they found that life went on as though nothing unpleasant had happened, apart from two small differences. Amelia no longer locked her bedroom door, but closed the shutters at night, and Edward slept with a pistol by him, which he had bought in Switzerland. The glorious Cumbrian autumn changed to bleak winter, and the Cranswells continued their peaceful existence until one night in March 1876. It was the nasty sound of fingernails scratching on glass which made Amelia sit bolt upright in bed. Somehow the intruder had forced the shutters and was trying to enter as it had the previous summer. Her cry brought Michael running to her room, while, pistol in hand, Edward raced through the door into the farmyard, which was lit by the moon riding in the sky of tattered clouds. At his sister's window he saw a form which he later described as a tall, spindly fellow in a curious cloak. A light shone through the panes of glass as Michael came in to his sister's aid. The thing at the window turned and ran through the stone archway above the entrance to the yard. Edward sprinted after the figure and saw it running between trees, bordering the drive, which curved towards the Croglin road. He paused, raised his pistol, and fired. In the moonlight he saw the enemy stagger, then continue jerkily across the narrow road and over the dark fields in the direction of Croglin village. Not waiting to reload, Edward followed over the rough ground, tripping and blundering into dry stone walls when clouds briefly hid the moon. He reached the edge of the village and had a final glimpse of the intruder disappearing into the old churchyard. Realizing at last that he had to deal with the supernatural, with a vampire, Edward returned to Croglin Low Hall for his brother. At dawn, a small party, the two Cranswells, a couple of their neighbours and a gamekeeper, approached the village church. The ground was shrouded with mist, out of which loomed old moss-covered tombs, and as they walked through the mist, the men appeared to be cut off at the waist. No one spoke, but curious looks were cast at the Australians. Their story of a vampire sounded so impossible that if they had not been well liked, their request for help would have been met with laughter. As the searchers moved between the headstones, the gamekeeper called out. The others crowded round, a slab which was partly out of place. They heaved it to one side and muttered in horror at what they saw lying beneath it. Sprawled inside an ancient coffin was a tall, mummified body with a circular hole in its thigh, which Edward realized had been made by his bullet. The men ran through the rusted gates, soon to return with armfuls of wood, which they built into a bonfire in the far corner of the burial ground. As the sun rose like a golden disk through the mist, they bent over the open grave, lifted out the skeletal form, stumbling in their haste to rid of their ghastly burden. They approached the blazing wood and heaved the Croglin Vampire into the flames. The story of Croglin Hall was written down by the Victorian author Augustine Hare in his book My Solitary Life, one volume of his autobiography, The Story of My Life. It had been told to him by Captain Fisher. While vampire legends are common in other parts of the world, especially East Europe, England has been mercifully free from these nightmarish creatures. There is only one other account of a vampire in England, and that goes back to the 13th century, when it was believed that vampires were responsible for outbreaks of plague. In his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, the chronicler William of Newburgh described how a master of Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, a stranger to God's grace and whose crimes were many, returned from the dead to haunt the town which the castle protected. During the hours of darkness, he would rise from his tomb to prowl the streets. The local priest told William of Newburgh how this monster was followed by such a stench of decay that plague appeared in Alnwick and many people fled. Some men realized that the vampire was the cause of the pestilence and banded together to rid the town of the menace. William wrote, "They armed themselves, therefore, with sharp spades, and betaking themselves to the cemetery, they began to dig. And whilst they yet thought they would have to dig much deeper, suddenly they came upon the body covered with a thin layer of earth. It was gorged and swollen with a frightful corpulence. One of the men struck the bloated body with the edge of his spade, and from the wound came a gush of fresh blood, proving that indeed it was a vampire. Immediately it was taken outside the town and burned to ashes, after which no more people caught the plague." Apart from the story of the vampire, Croglin has some other strange tales. One concerns its churchyard and a vicar who was there in the 1940s. He described his experience like this. "I was coming down from the town foot farm in a snowstorm. It was about 9 p.m. and very dark, and I had been for the milk. Just as I reached the churchyard wall, my attention was taken by what appeared to be a funeral party in the portion reserved for the old rectors at the east end of the church. The figures were vague and diaphanous, and one of them I recognized. It only lasted a short time, and I dismissed it from my mind as being imagination. About a week later, one of the villagers suddenly died during the thunderstorm. The widow pleaded with me that he should be buried near the old rectors, and the spot finally chosen was that where I had seen the phenomenon. This is the only experience of a psychic nature that I have ever had. The figure I had recognized was that of the widow." This is the man in the corner seat saying thank you for listening. Until the next time, good night.